When American helicopters initially arrived in Vietnam, military planners classified them as unarmed logistics transports. This doctrinal error would eventually lead to the destruction of nearly half the entire rotary wing fleet. Why did the military department send unarmed aircraft into combat zones? Official doctrine assumed that speed and altitude provided natural invulnerability. The strategy prioritized rapid logistics. The Bell UH-1 functioned as a flying truck. The standard crew consisted of 3 men: pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer. They bypassed the jungle. They moved cargo. No weapons, no armor. The combat zone shattered this theory. Ground personnel loaded heavy supply crates into the empty cabin. The rotor engaged. Takeoff commenced. Seconds later, ground machine gun fire perforated the thin fuselage. The engineering data explains the vulnerability. The aluminum skin of the Huey measured roughly 1 millimeter in thickness. It failed to stop a standard pistol bullet. Zero ballistic protection. A 23 millimeter anti-aircraft shell striking the airframe produced a sharp, violent sound of tearing aluminum. Enemy forces would eventually destroy almost 50% of all helicopters deployed in Vietnam. Viet Cong infantry analyzed American flight patterns. They calculated approach vectors. They established ambush zones for transport flights, entering landing clearings at low speeds. The enemy utilized Soviet equipment: 51 caliber heavy machine guns, 23 millimeter anti-aircraft autocannons. These weapons ripped airframes apart. Range exceeded 800 meters. Rocket-propelled grenades caused catastrophic structural failure upon impact. A single hit sufficed. Even standard infantry rifles severed exposed fuel lines. Ground fire killed pilots instantly. The command's theoretical miscalculation generated a precise statistical outcome. By 1973, enemy fire claimed exactly 5,607 unarmored helicopters. The escalating casualty rates of the initial unarmed flights forced enlisted mechanics to bypass standard operational procedures. Flight engineers ignored regulations. They initiated independent field modifications on their airframes using the M60 machine gun. Mechanics suspended the weapon from the cabin ceiling using heavy elastic bungee cords. Other technicians fabricated improvised pintle mounts directly in the open doorways. No official blueprints existed. The physical environment inside the fuselage permanently changed. The distinct odor of combusting aviation fuel mixed heavily with sharp cordite from continuous suppressive fire. Open doors functioned as active combat positions during every tactical takeoff and descent. This unauthorized engineering produced immediate statistical benefits. Suppressive fire disrupted enemy targeting. The tactical concept spread rapidly across frontline aviation units. Yet a spatial deficit remained. A single flight engineer possessed only one field of view. The opposite side of the aircraft sustained undefended damage. Aviation units unilaterally integrated a 4th crew member to cover the exposed hemisphere. The flight crews designated this new specialist the shotgun rider. Grassroots survival tactics forced a complete doctrinal shift. The military bureaucracy surrendered to field reality. Command officially wrote the 4th man into the standard aviation rosters. The newly designated door gunner maintained the hardware, directed confined landings, and actively scanned the blind spots. The formal institutionalization of the door gunner role instantly triggered a severe personnel deficit. Who staffed this suddenly emerged roster? Thousands of recent draftees faced deployment into conditions of absolute physical vulnerability. The systemic integration of this new occupational specialty required a massive transfer of unprepared personnel directly to the front lines. The Aviation Command demanded constant crew replenishment for the Vietnam War. The average age of a helicopter crew member stood at 19 to 20 years. This metric strictly reflected the demographic reality of the mass conscription system. The administration processed Private Wetzel as a standard statistical unit. He remained a single surname among thousands of nameless recruits. The bureaucracy worked fast. The Army placed him in an extremely aggressive professional environment. Thousands of young men occupied these open doorways. Training cycles remained brief. The military utilized them purely as operational resources. Alternative options did not exist. For the newly assigned personnel, delivering sustained fire at 100 miles per hour constituted an unprecedented test of biomechanical endurance. Standard infantry doctrine assumed stationary precision against static targets. Airborne reality dictated otherwise. Operators fired into dense foliage. They adjusted trajectory solely by observing tracer curvature against the forward momentum of the aircraft. The physical environment severely degraded human stability. Continuous low-frequency vibration from the transmission saturated the cabin floor. The shaking transferred directly through the boots of the operator during evasive maneuvers. The gunner linked individual ammunition segments by hand. He packed a continuous belt of 2,000 to 3,000 rounds into a metal box between his legs. This mass added over 80 pounds of static weight. He squeezed the spade grips. A solid stream of tracers dropped toward the canopy. The operator physically wrestled the mount to correct the impact zone. Crews primarily operated the M60 machine gun. Upgraded units deployed the M134 minigun. The rotary system discharged 6,000 rounds per minute. Operating this six-barrel platform required dedicated infrastructure. Engineers integrated a specialized electrical drive network. It drew 28 volts of direct current directly from the internal generators of the helicopter. Technical execution formed only the baseline of the operation. Psychological pressure peaked during target selection. The adversary wore civilian clothing. They blended perfectly into the agricultural sectors below. The operator possessed roughly 3 seconds to confirm hostile intent before clearing the engagement zone. Visual identification failed systematically. Ground units routinely encountered active combatants as young as 12 years old. The psychological burden of target identification multiplied. It collided with the absolute physical exposure of the open doorway. Why did this specific military occupational specialty demonstrate peak casualty rates? The answer lies in the total absence of structural barriers between the operator and enemy ground forces. Pilots sat behind plexiglass. They rested on steel armor plates. Door gunners had nothing. To maximize the field of fire, maintenance crews routinely stripped the heavy sliding doors off the transport helicopters. The operator sat on the floor edge. Wind blasted his face. Below him, the jungle canopy hid systematic sniper ambushes. Viet Cong marksmen tracked the incoming flight paths. They focused on the landing zones. They targeted the gunners first. Eliminating the gunner neutralized the primary defensive asset. Survival depended on issued equipment. The equipment failed the environmental reality. Standard flak jackets stopped shrapnel. They failed against direct rifle rounds. The military introduced heavy ceramic chest protectors. Crews called them chicken plates. The aircrew body armor weighed over 9 kilograms. It covered only the frontal torso. The flanks remained completely exposed to lateral fire. In the 90-degree tropical climate, the solid ceramic blocked all air circulation. The suffocating weight trapped against the chest forced many operators to discard the plates entirely. They chose mobility. They sacrificed ballistic protection. Enemy fire provided only one vector of lethality. Centrifugal force dictated the rest. During evasive maneuvers to avoid ground fire, the helicopter banked at sharp angles. Gravity shifted instantly. Gunners operated while wearing a standard safety tether. The manual called it a monkey harness. The nylon strap of the monkey harness provided a strict mechanical compromise. It never prevented the operator from falling out of the aircraft. It merely guaranteed the human body remained attached to the fuselage. A sharp evasive roll ripped the gunner from the floorboards. He lost his balance. He tumbled past the skids into open space. The tether snapped taut. The operator hung outside in the slipstream. Inside the cabin, the remaining crew members grabbed the tensioned webbing and physically hauled the dangling gunner back onto the aluminum deck. In January 1968, Private Gary Wetzel would lose his left arm in the Mekong Delta. Yet in February 1966, He was merely completing basic training at Fort Leonard Wood. The timeline from raw recruit to disabled veteran spanned less than 2 years. His demographic profile was standard for the era. Working-class family, 9 children, minimal academic interest. He enlisted at age 18. The military initially retained him as a heavy equipment instructor. Wetzel submitted a formal deployment request. The command denied the transfer. He submitted a second application. Approval followed. By October 1966, Wetzel arrived in Vietnam. The command assigned him to a rear echelon ordnance unit. Wetzel utilized an administrative loophole to force a transfer. He re-enlisted while still in country. This procedural action granted him the right to select a new assignment. He requested the 173rd Assault Helicopter Company. This specific aviation unit specialized in direct combat insertions. Such an operational profile made the statistical probability of an airframe loss one of the highest in the sector. High casualty rates demanded constant personnel rotation. Wetzel adapted rapidly. By early 1967, he manned the cabin machine gun. By January 1968, he stood as one of the most experienced operators in his squadron. The physical toll was absolute. Before the January 8th operation, Wetzel had already survived 4 separate helicopter shootdowns. By early 1968, Wetzel routinely operated in so-called hot landing zones. Why did the helicopter become a perfect target? Hovering to drop troops completely stripped the machine of maneuverability. The aircraft descended into hostile jungle clearings. It stopped in mid-air. While the engine transmission strained to maintain altitude, the unarmored hull vibrated harshly under the crew's feet. A hovering UH-1 Huey presented a stationary 17-meter target. It carried no heavy armor plating. Enemy ground forces waited in ambush below. Continuous suppressive fire provided the only mathematical chance of survival. The door gunner had to maintain an unbroken stream of lead into the tree line. This relentless suppression forced hostile troops to stay down. Under this narrow window of cover, infantry scrambled out of the cabin. A single pause in firing guaranteed direct enemy hits on the fragile fuselage. The gunner functioned as the critical survival component. Hostile units prioritized them as primary targets immediately upon approach. Consequently, gunners continued firing even after receiving fatal wounds. Recovery teams routinely discovered dead operators still holding their machine guns. Muscle spasms and operational conditioning kept their hands permanently locked onto the spade grips. They maintained the trigger pull until complete biological failure. Tactical reality demanded this mechanical routine during every combat drop. On January 8, 1968, Command issued a standard reinforcement directive. Wetzel boarded his helicopter. The assault group took off toward a flooded rice paddy sector near Ap Dong An. A shape-charged RPG warhead obliterated the frontal plexiglass. The cockpit disintegrated. It was January 8, 1968. Transport 866 descended to deliver reinforcements for the 9th Infantry Division. Command anticipated a routine tactical insertion. Instead, the aircraft entered a synchronized kill zone of 51mm machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. A secondary rocket detonated right beside the door gunner. The human body possesses no physiological mechanisms to compensate for the extreme barotrauma of a close proximity anti-tank explosion. The overpressure wave hit hard. It sheared Wetzel's left arm. Muscle tissue and bone detached instantly. The kinetic force ejected his body from the fuselage. He slammed into the flooded rice paddy. Dirty water mixed with leaking aviation fuel coated his uniform. Inside the wreckage, physical trauma cascaded. Warrant Officer Timothy Artman took multiple high-velocity rounds to his lower extremities. Arterial damage triggered rapid hypovolemic shock. A separate bullet trajectory shattered the co-pilot's thumb joint. Flying shrapnel lacerated the crew chief's chest. Blood saturated the flight controls. Trapped inside the crushed aluminum frame, 3 critically injured crew members bled simultaneously. Submerged in the contaminated water of the rice paddy, the 20-year-old gunner defaulted to basic physiological reflexes. Massive hemorrhage began immediately. The organism approached total collapse. How does a soldier maintain fire after a traumatic amputation? Systemic shock usually paralyzes the central nervous system. Wetzel anchored the severed remains of his left arm inside his uniform to free his working hand. The mechanical click of the Thompson submachine gun bolt sounded sharp. He racked the 10-pound weapon using only his right arm. His body failed in the mud. Arterial bleeding rapidly depleted his blood volume. A hostile combatant advanced toward the helicopter wreckage with an explosive device. Wetzel engaged the target. The soldier fell. He neutralized the immediate threat. Static positioning guaranteed fatal exsanguination. The gunner forced himself upright. He initiated movement back toward the destroyed aircraft. Another projectile shattered his right leg during the transit. He did not stop. One functioning limb operated two distinct weapon platforms in a single sequence. The gunner pulled himself inside the ruined cabin and resumed his standard position behind the M60 machine gun. The operational firepower of the crew collapsed to a single heavy asset. Wetzel initiated contact through the M60 machine gun. The mechanics of heavy weapons dictate strict physical parameters. The gun produces a cyclic rate between 550 and 650 rounds per minute. Controlling the sightline requires maximum muscular tension from an uninjured operator utilizing two hands. Wetzel absorbed the violent recoil with one intact arm. Hostile crossfire pinned the American infantry to the open landing zone. A specific target generated the highest casualty rate. The threat originated from a camouflaged bunker. The enemy reinforced the position with compacted earth and dense foliage to completely mask a narrow firing aperture. Wetzel tracked the muzzle flashes. He reduced the engagement to a strict ballistic equation. He directed a continuous stream of lead straight into the fortified slit. Output volume negated the enemy cover. The hostile operators ceased fire. The tactical geometry of the extraction zone shifted immediately. The American infantry regained mobility. Soldiers advanced. They formed a baseline defense. The survival of the entire ground element hinged on the neutralization of exactly one enemy machine gun position. The suppression of the bunker provided the tactical pause required to extract Commander Artman. Crew members dragged the wounded pilot toward an earthen dike. Wetzel joined the recovery effort. He collapsed from severe hemorrhage. He regained consciousness. He resumed pulling. The physical exertion forced him into unconsciousness a second time. How long did the evacuation take? The survivors remained under fire in a flooded field for 10 to 12 hours. Artman succumbed to his injuries 6 hours post-crash. Medical evacuation helicopters could not penetrate the active combat zone. Extraction eventually succeeded. Field surgeons assessed Wetzel's shattered left arm. They executed an immediate amputation. This procedure prevented localized necrosis from developing into a fatal systemic infection. Resuscitation protocols demanded massive interventions. Medical staff administered 18 units of whole blood to stabilize his vital signs. That volume equals approximately 8.5 liters. An average adult male circulatory system contains only 5 liters. The medical team achieved a complete volumetric replacement of his entire blood supply. The military apparatus processed these survival metrics into official state documentation. On November 19, 1968, the federal administration formalized the battlefield incident. The location shifted to the East Room of the White House. The sterile, highly regulated environment of the state residence presented a stark visual contrast to the veterans' permanent physical trauma. The official citation confirmed the precise tactical elimination of the enemy emplacement. President Lyndon Johnson stepped forward. He placed the Medal of Honor around Gary Wetzel's neck. The combat incident on January 8, 1968, exposed the systemic limits of makeshift helicopter modifications. What operational need compelled crews to alter these utility machines? A critical shortage of specialized aviation support for ground troops dictated the shift. Maintenance units initiated continuous platform upgrades. They bolted on additional machine guns, then grenade launchers, then heavy rocket pods. Mechanics installed forward-firing armament assemblies. They routed the weapon control linkages directly to the pilot stations. But the UH-1 airframe operated under a maximum takeoff weight of roughly 9,500 pounds, 4,300 kilograms. This hard metric strictly governed the addition of protective armor and heavy ordnance. The improvised gunships accumulated critical excess mass. Turbine fuel consumption escalated. Operating range dropped. Armed configurations lacked the velocity to maintain formation with standard slicks post-insertion. The technical platform failed to sustain the dual-purpose mandate. Flight personnel executed a mandatory structural compromise. Aviation mechanics stripped out the infantry seats, dismantled the utility hardware, and loaded the bare cabins exclusively with dedicated strike weapons and bulk ammunition. The structural vulnerability of utility helicopters forced a systemic overhaul. In mid-1967, the military introduced the UH-1 Cobra. This specialized attack platform fundamentally altered flight operations. Its velocity exceeded the standard Huey by 100 miles per hour. Speed provided a primary defensive advantage. The daily working conditions for aviation personnel underwent a radical physical transformation. Previously, gunners operated unsecured weapons from an open fuselage door. Wind, dust, and engine exhaust constantly filled the cabin. Now, crews occupied an enclosed tandem cockpit. Mechanics bolted heavy armored seats directly into the frame. Self-sealing polymer fuel bladders replaced the unshielded utility tanks. The physical void of the open cargo bay disappeared. The gunner sat forward. He controlled a chin-mounted turret through internal optical sights. The automated system integrated a minigun and a grenade launcher. This inline seating arrangement compressed the frontal projection of the aircraft to 38 inches, less than 1 meter. Statistical field reports confirmed this minimized profile significantly reduced the probability of sustaining direct ground fire impacts. The development of this enclosed protective workspace required extensive empirical data. The defense industry initiated mass production only after evaluating the sustained attrition rates of improvised gunships. The shift was reactive. The technological transition from exposed open doors to sealed armored glass followed years of vulnerability. Military casualty manifests documented the exact human cost of this procedural delay. Prior to the specialized strike platform, dead flight mechanics and door gunners exceeded 2,700. Among the personnel who survived the operational phase, prior to armored cabin standardization, stands Gary Wetzel. He currently resides in Wisconsin. He is in his late 70s. What sustains the social integration of these veterans? Regular participation in regulated memorial initiatives. Wetzel rides in the annual Rolling Thunder motorcycle procession. The convoy advances to Washington. This assembly mobilizes hundreds of thousands of participants. It operates as the primary instrument for veterans' social visibility nationwide. Personal trauma integrates into public memory. The physical act of fastening the Medal of Honor serves as a strictly regulated memory trigger for fallen colleagues. Wetzel rejects the hero classification entirely. He defines his past actions as standard operational duty, a soldier assisting his unit. This continuous institutionalized memorial activity traces back to a singular chronological baseline. The catalyzing combat incident occurred on January 8, 1968.